The morning train thundered across the open prairie beneath a sky painted with soft shades of gold. Thick clouds of steam drifted behind the black locomotive as its whistle echoed through the quiet valleys of Montana Territory. Inside one worn passenger car, travelers spoke in hushed voices while others stared through dusty windows, wondering what waited at the end of the journey. Near the back sat a young woman dressed in a faded blue traveling dress and a weathered brown hat. Her hands rested tightly around a small leather suitcase that looked far older than she was. She was called Clara Bennett, though few people on the train knew her name. Every few moments she unfolded a letter, read it once more, and quietly folded it again. The letter had never been meant for her. It belonged to another woman, a mail-order bride named Emily Harper, who had fallen seriously ill before the journey. With no family left and nowhere else to go, Clara had agreed to deliver the letter to the rancher waiting at the station. She planned to explain everything before returning on the next train. But fear whispered that no one would believe her. Outside, the train slowed as smoke curled into the crisp morning air. "Silver Creek," the conductor called. "End of the line." Passengers gathered their belongings. Clara took a deep breath and stepped onto the wooden platform. Waiting beside the station stood a tall rancher wearing a black hat and a dust-covered coat. His broad shoulders and calm gray eyes made him easy to recognize from the description in the letter. Ethan Walker. He removed his hat politely. "You must have had a long trip." Clara swallowed. "Sir. I think there's been a mistake." Before she could explain further, another passenger accidentally bumped into her, sending the letter fluttering onto the platform. Ethan picked it up, noticed his own name written across the envelope, and handed it back with a gentle smile. "You can explain after breakfast," he said kindly. No traveler should speak on an empty stomach. His voice held no anger. Only patience. Clara looked around the empty station. The train whistle sounded again. Before she could decide whether to climb back aboard, the locomotive slowly pulled away. She watched it disappear across the prairie. Now she was completely alone. Ethan quietly reached for her suitcase. "If you're willing," he said, "my ranch is only an hour away." Clara hesitated. Then, with nowhere else to turn, she nodded. Neither of them knew that one simple decision would change both of their lives forever. The horse-drawn wagon rolled slowly along a winding dirt road bordered by wildflowers and endless grasslands. Hawks circled overhead while the cool morning breeze carried the scent of pine trees from the distant hills. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Ethan guided the horses with steady hands. Clara stared at the passing countryside. Finally she gathered enough courage. "Mr. Walker. I truly am not the woman you were expecting." He glanced toward her without surprise. "I guessed that." Clara blinked. "You did?" "The letter looked older than your hands. Someone had folded it many times before you ever touched it." She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry. There is nothing to apologize for." She slowly explained everything. Emily Harper had become dangerously sick only days before the trip. Clara had been caring for her at the boarding house. Emily feared Ethan would wait forever without knowing why she never arrived. So Clara promised to carry the letter west. "I only meant to deliver it," Clara whispered. "I never planned to stay." Ethan listened quietly until she finished. Then he smiled. "Thank you for keeping your promise to someone who needed kindness." His answer surprised her more than anger ever could. "You aren't upset?" "I've spent enough years being angry at life." His smile faded slightly. "My parents are gone. My younger brother died during a harsh winter. Since then, this ranch has been mostly silent." The wagon reached the top of a hill. Below stretched hundreds of acres of grazing cattle, red barns, white fences, and a sturdy farmhouse overlooking a sparkling river. "It isn't much," Ethan said. Clara looked in amazement. "It looks beautiful." As they arrived, an old sheepdog hurried toward the wagon, barking happily before gently resting beside Clara's feet. She laughed for the first time in many months. Ethan noticed. It was a warm, honest laugh that filled the quiet ranch like the first birdsong after winter. For reasons he could not explain, the lonely place already felt a little more like home. Far beyond the ranch, the train whistle echoed faintly across the plains, as if reminding them both that the wrong journey sometimes led exactly where a person was meant to be. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm. Each sunrise painted the prairie in shades of gold as Clara rose early to help around the ranch. She swept the porch, prepared simple breakfasts, mended torn shirts, and learned to care for the horses. Though Ethan had never asked her to work, she wanted to earn the kindness he had shown her. The ranch slowly came alive. One afternoon, Ethan found Clara sitting beside a young colt that had cut its leg on a broken fence. She cleaned the wound with warm water and wrapped it carefully with strips of clean cloth. "You've done this before," Ethan said. Clara smiled softly. "My father raised horses. He always said frightened animals only need a calm voice." The colt gently rested its nose against Clara's shoulder. Ethan smiled. "It seems he taught you well." That evening, they repaired the broken fence together. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, they shared stories while hammering fresh wooden rails into the ground. "I wanted to become a schoolteacher once," Clara admitted. "What happened?" "My parents died during a fever outbreak. After that, I worked wherever I could just to survive." Ethan quietly drove another nail into the fence. "I'm sorry." She looked toward the endless fields. "We all carry something heavy." The next morning, a neighbor named Mrs. Harper stopped by with a basket of fresh bread. She smiled warmly at Clara. "So this must be Ethan's bride." Clara quickly shook her head. "Oh, no. I'm only—" Before she could finish, Ethan answered gently. "She's my guest." Mrs. Harper simply smiled. "Well, you're always welcome in Silver Creek." As the older woman rode away, Clara looked at Ethan. "You could have explained everything." "I could have. Why didn't you?" He shrugged with a quiet smile. "Some folks enjoy guessing more than listening." For the first time in years, laughter echoed across the ranch. That night they sat beside a campfire near the river. Sparks floated into the dark sky while coyotes howled in the distant hills. Neither spoke for a long while. Sometimes silence was easier than words. Clara realized she had stopped counting the days since she arrived. Without noticing, the lonely ranch had begun to feel like the safest place she had ever known. Late one afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the prairie, bringing wind and rain. Ethan and Clara hurried the cattle into the barn before the storm reached the valley. Rain hammered against the wooden roof while thunder echoed through the hills. Inside the barn, they worked side by side, calming frightened horses and stacking fresh hay where it would stay dry. Then they heard another sound. A wagon approached through the storm. A tall man stepped down, his coat soaked by the rain. Clara's face turned pale. She whispered only one word. "Thomas." Ethan noticed the fear in her eyes. "Do you know him?" She nodded slowly. Thomas Briggs removed his hat and walked toward the barn. "There you are," he said, forcing a smile. "I've been looking for you." Clara stood silently. Thomas turned toward Ethan. "I'm her employer." She left town without saying goodbye. Clara finally found her voice. "I left because you wouldn't let me leave." The barn grew quiet except for the rain. Thomas sighed. "I only wanted my money back. I paid your debts after your parents died." "You made me work every day for 3 years," Clara answered firmly. The debt was already paid. Ethan stepped between them. "If she doesn't wish to return, then the matter is finished." Thomas frowned. "This is none of your business." Ethan remained calm. "She's under my roof now." For several long moments, no one spoke. Finally Thomas shook his head. "You've changed, Clara." "No," she answered quietly. "I finally found people who treat me with respect." Thomas looked around the ranch before climbing back into his wagon. "You'll regret this." He drove away into the rain. Clara's hands trembled. Ethan gently placed his coat over her shoulders. "You're safe here." Tears filled her eyes. "No one has ever stood up for me before." He smiled gently. "Then someone should have done it sooner." The storm slowly passed. As the last raindrops fell from the barn roof, Clara realized that the greatest shelter she had found wasn't the building around her. It was the quiet strength of the man standing beside her. Life on the ranch slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm after Thomas Briggs left. The autumn air grew cooler, and every morning the prairie shimmered beneath a blanket of golden sunlight. Clara no longer felt like a visitor. She knew every horse by name, every path through the fields, and every corner of the old farmhouse. One evening, Ethan invited her to ride with him to the highest hill on the property. From there, the entire valley stretched before them. The river reflected the setting sun like a ribbon of gold, while cattle grazed peacefully below. "It gets quiet up here," Ethan said. Clara smiled. "I like the quiet." For a while, they simply watched the sunset. Then Ethan spoke again. "When I first came to this ranch, I thought loneliness was something a man simply learned to live with." Clara looked at him. "And now?" He took a slow breath. "Now I know loneliness disappears when the right person walks through your gate." Her heart raced. She lowered her eyes. "I never meant to stay." "I know. But every day I wonder if I should leave before people start talking." Ethan smiled gently. "Let them talk." She looked at him in surprise. "I don't care what the town believes." He removed his worn leather gloves. "I only care about what you want." Clara felt tears warming her eyes. "I've spent so much of my life believing I didn't belong anywhere." Ethan quietly reached for her hand. "Then stay where you're wanted." For the first time, their hands met. Neither hurried to let go. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the hill while the last rays of sunlight surrounded them in warm gold. Without another word, both understood that friendship had quietly become something much deeper. Several weeks later, the people of Silver Creek gathered for the annual harvest festival beside the little wooden church. Children laughed as horses pulled decorated wagons through the streets. Music drifted from fiddles, and neighbors shared fresh bread, pies, and warm cider. Clara had finally become part of the community. Mrs. Harper hugged her warmly. "It feels like you've always lived here." Clara smiled. "For the first time, it feels that way." Just then, the stagecoach arrived carrying a familiar passenger. Emily Harper. She had recovered from her illness at last. Clara hurried forward and embraced her. "I'm so glad you're well." Emily smiled through grateful tears. "I came because I owed both of you an apology." She turned toward Ethan. "I was the woman who answered your advertisement." Ethan nodded kindly. "I'm thankful you recovered." Emily laughed softly. "I believe the Lord had a different plan." She looked at Clara and then back at Ethan. "You were never meant to marry me." She reached into her bag and handed Ethan the original marriage agreement. "It belongs to the past." Ethan folded the paper without opening it. "The past brought me exactly where I needed to be." Emily smiled knowingly before quietly leaving them alone. As the church bell rang across the valley, Ethan turned toward Clara. "I waited for a bride." He smiled. "But I found my partner." He gently took both of her hands. "Clara Bennett, would you choose this ranch, and would you choose me?" Happy tears filled her eyes. "I thought I'd stepped off the wrong train." She laughed softly through her tears. "But I stepped into the life I'd been praying for." "I'll take that as a yes." She nodded. "Yes." The church bell rang once more, and the entire town cheered as neighbors realized exactly what had happened. On a bright spring morning, wildflowers covered the hill surrounding the little white church. Friends and neighbors filled the wooden pews, smiling as sunlight streamed through the windows. Clara walked down the aisle wearing a simple ivory dress sewn by the women of Silver Creek. She carried a small bouquet of prairie flowers gathered that very morning. At the front stood Ethan, waiting with the same quiet smile he had worn the day they first met at the train station. The minister spoke gently about love, faith, trust, and second chances. When the vows were finished, Ethan looked into Clara's eyes. "I was waiting for someone I thought I wanted." He smiled warmly. "But God sent me someone I truly needed." Clara squeezed his hands. "And I thought my journey had ended when the train stopped." She smiled through joyful tears. It was only the beginning. After the ceremony, the whole town celebrated beneath strings of lanterns outside the church. Children danced, fiddles played cheerful tunes, and neighbors shared homemade meals around long wooden tables. As evening approached, Ethan and Clara rode slowly toward their ranch. The familiar road no longer felt lonely. Smoke rose peacefully from the farmhouse chimney. The horses grazed quietly near the barn. The faithful old sheepdog ran happily beside them. They stopped on the porch and looked across the endless prairie glowing beneath a golden sunset. Months earlier, a frightened young woman had stepped off a train believing she had arrived at the wrong place. Instead, she had found kindness instead of judgment. Friendship instead of loneliness. Love instead of fear. Ethan wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched the last light disappear beyond the distant mountains. Sometimes life changes because of careful plans. Sometimes it changes because of unexpected mistakes. And sometimes, the greatest love stories begin the moment the wrong bride steps off the train, and the right man chooses her without hesitation. The end.